France, the late 18th century, a kingdom of brilliance and decay. In the glittering halls of Versailles, chandeliers shimmer like frozen suns, scattering light across golden walls and marble floors. Courtiers drifted to the palace like painted ghosts, their laughter echoing off mirrors that reflected nothing of the world beyond. Perfumed air hid the rot beneath. Every gesture, every word, every glance at court was part of fragile performance, a ballet of power and pride. But beyond those golden gates, another France lived, a France of hunger. In narrow city streets and cold, empty fields, millions struggled to survive. Mothers bartered for bread. Children cried from hunger. The smell of damp earth and with smoke filled the air. The people worked, paid, and prayed, while their lords dined, danced, and ruled. According to recorded history, the average Parisian worker spent nearly half his income on bread alone. And when the harvest failed in the 1780s, misery became unbearable. Famine hollowed the eyes of the poor. The price of a loaf could mean the loss of a life. Yet even in the depths of despair, something new was stirring, an idea. Across France, in smoky taverns and candlelit salons, voices whispered of a different world. The writings of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu spread like wildfire through the minds of students, workers, and dreamers. They spoke of reason, liberty, and equality. They dared to ask dangerous questions. Why should one man rule by birth? Why should another be born only to serve? Historians believe that this was the spark that lit the flame, the moment when thought became rebellion. For the Enlightenment had given the people something greater than hope. It had given them imagination. And imagination, once awakened, is impossible to silence. This was France before the storm, a nation divided by wealth, bound by injustice, and standing unknowingly at the edge of a revolution that would change the world. At the center of this restless kingdom stood King Louis XVI, a man of contradictions, intelligent yet indecisive, kind yet powerless to act. He was a ruler who preferred his workshop to his throne, fascinated more by locks and clocks than by politics or people. Some accounts suggest he wanted to do good, but good intentions could not save a dying kingdom. France's treasury was empty. Years of war, including costly support for the American Revolution, had drained the nation's gold. Taxes crushed the poor while the rich remained untouched. The country teetered on the edge of ruin, and the king, desperate for solutions, turned to his advisors, men who feared change more than collapse. Beside him stood Marie Antoinette, young, elegant, and foreign. She was a queen of fashion and rumor, adored and despised in equal measure. To the starving masses, she became the face of indifference, the embodiment of Versailles excess. Madame Deficit, they called her, as pamphlets accused her of heartless luxury. Historians believe much of it was false, but in an age of outrage, truth mattered less than the story. By 1789, the kingdom could no longer pretend. Louis summoned the States General, a grand assembly representing the three orders of society: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, the Third Estate. It was the first such gathering in 175 years. Hope flickered across the nation. Perhaps now, at last, the people would be heard. But when they arrived in Versailles, that hope quickly turned to anger. The First and Second Estates clung to privilege. The Third was silenced, ignored, and dismissed. For weeks they argued over votes and rights, until patience shattered. The representatives of the common people broke away, declaring themselves the National Assembly, the voice of France itself. When they found their meeting hall locked, they gathered instead in an indoor tennis court and swore an oath never to disband until a constitution had been written. The tennis court oath became the revolution's first act of defiance, a declaration that power no longer flowed from the crown, but from the people. Historians believe that in that hot, crowded room, filled with sweat, passion, resolve, a new France was born. The walls trembled not with music or prayer, but with the sound of history turning. The old order had been challenged, and the crown had begun to crack. July 1789. The air in Paris was electric with fear. Rumors whispered that royal troops were gathering to crush the assembly, that the king would strike back, that freedom itself would die in its cradle. The people, desperate, furious, hungry, searched for weapons. Their eyes turned toward a looming fortress at the city's edge, the Bastille. A relic of medieval stone, the Bastille had once imprisoned poets, heretics, and rebels. Though nearly empty now, it remained a symbol of royal tyranny, the shadow of fear that had haunted Paris for centuries. On the morning of July 14th, crowds filled the streets. Tens of thousands marched, armed with muskets, pikes, and raw determination. They demanded gunpowder and the surrender of the fortress. The governor, Bernard de Launay, refused. Then a shot was fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger, but in that single sound, centuries of silence broke apart. The battle began. For hours, smoke and chaos filled the air. Cannon fire roared from the towers. Men fell by the hundreds. Yet still, the crowd surged forward, scaling walls, breaking gates, fighting for a freedom they had never known but already claimed as their own. By evening, the Bastille had fallen. Delaunay was dragged through the streets, beaten and killed. His head, lifted on a pike, became a banner of triumph and terror. The old regime had drawn first blood, and the people had answered. Historians believe that the fall of the Bastille was not simply the end of a prison, but the death of fear itself. Across France, church bells rang and crowds rejoiced. The impossible had happened. A king's fortress had fallen to his people. But even as they celebrated, the revolution's future darkened. The storm had broken, but it would not pass quickly, and the blood that touched the cobblestones of Paris that day would soon flow through every corner of the kingdom. Autumn 1789. The heat of rebellion had given way to hunger once more. Paris starved as the price of bread soared higher than any voice of reason. The scent of fresh loaves from royal bakeries hung in the air like mockery. In the markets, women muttered through gritted teeth, their anger sharpening like knives. Then came the spark. A rumor spread that the king's guards of Versailles had trampled the tricolor cockade, the symbol of the revolution, beneath their boots. To many, it was an insult not just to the assembly, but to the people themselves. On the morning of October 5th, thousands of women poured into the streets. Mothers, fishwives, servants, armed with kitchen knives, clubs, muskets, and fury. Their cries echoed through the city. Bread, bread. Historians describe them as an unstoppable tide, ragged, soaked from the rain, marching the 12 miles to Versailles. They were joined by soldiers from the National Guard, led by Lafayette, the hero of 2 revolutions. By evening, the palace gates trembled under the weight of the crowd. Inside, Louis hesitated, as always, caught between fear and duty. When the mob finally broke through, chaos swept the gilded halls. They surged into the Queen's apartments, shouting her name, Marie Antoinette, a sound that must have chilled the marble itself. The Queen fled barefoot through back corridors to the king's side. When the crowd demanded her presence, she stepped onto the balcony, pale, proud, and trembling. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, unexpectedly, the mob fell silent. Some even bowed. By 1792, France stood at war, not only with kings abroad, but with itself. Austria and Prussia threatened invasion to restore Louis to power. Inside the country, rebellion flared from royalist regions to radical clubs. Paris was a volcano of fear and fury, ready to erupt. The revolution devoured moderation. The people wanted justice, and justice had begun to mean blood. On August 10th, 1792, thousands stormed the Tuileries Palace. They broke through the gates, cut down the Swiss guards, and drenched the marble floors in crimson. The royal family fled once again, this time seeking refuge in the assembly itself. But the assembly could no longer protect them. The monarchy was suspended. Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre, became Louis Capet, citizen of a republic not yet born. In September, the National Convention declared the birth of the French Republic. Church bells rang, cannons thundered, and the people cheered, not for a ruler, but for themselves. They had broken the chains of 1,000 years of monarchy. But the victory was poisoned with vengeance. The prisons overflowed with suspects, nobles, priests, and anyone accused of treason. Some accounts suggest the smell of blood in the streets mixed with the stench of decay. The city had become a beast, devouring both guilt and innocence alike. Amid the chaos, one figure rose to power. Maximilien Robespierre, the lawyer from Arras, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed, unyielding. To his followers, he was virtue incarnate. To his enemies, a prophet of terror. France had entered a new age, not of kings, but of conviction. An age when the guillotine gleamed like a blade of justice in the sun. And in its shadow stood a king awaiting judgment. Perfect. Let us continue deeper into the storm. The revolution enters its darkest, most defining phase. Winter, 1792. The streets of Paris lay beneath a cold, heavy sky. The revolution had devoured its illusions of peace. It now demanded justice. And at its center stood one man, the former King of France. Louis Capet, as he was now called, was placed on trial before the National Convention. The charge: treason against the nation he once ruled. No monarch in French history had ever faced such a moment. Before him sat the Assembly of Deputies, each man a judge and a witness to the fall of centuries. Louis listened as evidence was read. Letters, decrees, the failed escape to Varennes. Historians believe he appeared calm, even dignified, throughout the proceedings. His words were soft, his gestures precise. He did not beg for mercy. "I am innocent of the crimes imputed to me," he said. "I forgive those who are my enemies, and I pray that my blood may cement the happiness of France." But the convention had already decided his fate. The revolution no longer needed a king. It needed a symbol, one final act to prove that the old order was dead forever. On January 20th, 1793, the deputies voted. Out of 721, a narrow majority chose death. The monarchy was condemned, not by swords or mobs, but by the voice of the people. The next morning, as the first pale light touched Paris, Louis was led to the Place de la Revolution, where a new instrument of equality awaited, the guillotine. Drums rolled. Soldiers stood silent. A crowd of thousands gathered in breathless cold. He mounted the scaffold with steady steps. "People of France," he cried, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I forgive those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never fall upon France." The drums drowned his final words. The blade fell. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Then came a roar, wild, deafening, endless. The head of the king was held aloft, crimson dripping onto the wooden stage of a new age. According to recorded history, some fainted, others cheered, some wept. No one remained untouched. The monarchy of 1,000 years had ended in a single strike of steel. France was free, but freedom, it seemed, had no mercy. Revolution had triumphed, but victory birthed paranoia. Enemies were everywhere, or so it was believed. Royalists conspired in secret. Foreign armies marched at the borders. Famine stalked the land. And within the heart of the Republic, factions tore each other apart. The Committee of Public Safety was formed, 12 men who claimed to protect the revolution at any cost. Among them rose Maximilien Robespierre, a man of icy virtue, whose words could ignite both hope and horror. Historians describe Robespierre as incorruptible, devoted entirely to the idea of moral purity. He believed that the Republic could not survive without virtue, and virtue, he argued, must be defended by terror. Paris became a city of whispers. Neighbors accused neighbors. Priests, nobles, and peasants alike vanished in the night. The guillotine, once a symbol of justice, became a machine of fear. According to accounts, the blade fell so often that carts of sawdust were laid beneath it to soak the blood. In a single year, over 16,000 people were executed, many without trial. The cries of the condemned echoed to the Place de la Revolution, mingling with the cheers of those who believed they were witnessing salvation. Among the victims was Marie Antoinette. Imprisoned for months, separated from her children, she faced her death with a quiet grace. When she ascended the scaffold on October 16th, 1793, she wore a simple white gown. As she stepped on the executioner's foot, she whispered, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not mean to." Moments later, the blade fell, and the crowd erupted once more. The queen was gone. The revolution had consumed both the tyrant and the symbol of tyranny. But still, the blood did not stop. In the provinces, civil war raged. In Paris, suspicion turned inward. The revolution began to devour its own children. Danton de Molay, Hébert, Men who had once shouted together for liberty now condemned each other to the guillotine. And through it all, Robespierre stood unmoved, pale and relentless. He spoke of purity, of the Republic of virtue. Yet the air of France was thick with smoke and death. By the summer of 1794, the revolution had reached its fever. France was exhausted. The war still raged, but victory was near. And yet, in Paris, the executions continued. Fear had replaced faith. The people whispered that no one was safe, not even those who once cried, "Vive la République," in the streets. Robespierre stood before the convention, his eyes burning with conviction. He accused his fellow deputies of corruption, of betrayal, of treason. He spoke for hours, denouncing enemies without naming them. Every man in the room heard his own death sentence hidden within those words. Historians believe that speech sealed his fate. The next morning, the convention turned on him. Soldiers arrested Robespierre and his closest allies. They were taken to the very machine they had commanded for so long. On July 28, 1794, as the midday sun blazed over Paris, the guillotine gleamed once again. One by one, the architects of terror were executed. When Robespierre's turn came, his jaw was shattered from a failed suicide attempt. He could not speak. He could not defend himself. The crowd that once cheered him now shouted with joy at his fall. As the blade descended, a thunderous roar rose from the square, the sound of a nation exhaling after a year of suffocation. The reign of terror was over, but France was left haunted by memory, by guilt, by the question that echoed in every survivor's heart. Had the revolution destroyed tyranny or merely replaced it with another? The guillotine stood silent. The summer of 1794 brought with it an eerie calm, not peace, but exhaustion. The revolution that had once promised liberty, equality, fraternity, had devoured itself. France was drenched in both freedom and fear. When Robespierre's head fell, the spell broke. The people looked upon the empty scaffold as though awakening from a fever. The very men who had cheered the terror now spoke of moderation, of reconciliation, of rest. But the wounds ran deep. Families had been torn apart, churches desecrated, cities scarred. The air of Paris carried a silence heavier than the roar that came before. According to recorded history, the Thermidorian reaction began, a slow turning of the wheel. The prisons opened their doors, and the survivors stumbled out, blinking at the light. The Jacobin clubs were closed. The Committee of Public Safety was dismantled. Revolutionary zeal cooled into weariness. Yet beneath the surface, the old fears lingered. The poor still starved. The rich returned cautiously to their salons, and the politicians quarreled in the same halls where kings had once ruled. France had overthrown a crown, a church, and a system, but not its chaos. Historians believe that by 1795, the revolution had entered its twilight. It was no longer a cry of the people, but a struggle of factions, a game of survival played by men who had once called themselves saviors. In this fragile peace, a new government was born. The Directory, 5 men who ruled not by faith or vision, but by compromise and fear. They promised stability, but their rule was marked by corruption and indecision. The people, once hungry for liberty, were now hungry for order. And in the shadow of their failures, a figure began to rise. He was not born of noble blood, nor groomed for command. He came from Corsica, a small island on the edge of France, ambitious, sharp-eyed, and restless. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Historians describe him as a man of contradictions, cold yet charismatic, calculating yet visionary. He read the revolution like a book, understanding both its promise and its exhaustion. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. In 1795, when royalists rose in rebellion against a new government, it was Napoleon who crushed them with cannon fire on the steps of Paris. A whiff of grape shot, as some accounts say. That moment made him famous. The Directory saw in him a savior, and the army saw in him a leader. Within years, victory followed victory. At Toulon, at Lodi, at Arcole, he marched through Europe like a storm made flesh. Soldiers adored him. The people adored him more. To a nation weary of blood and talk, he brought something that felt like purpose. France wanted glory again, not philosophy, not chaos, but triumph. and Napoleon gave it to them. He promised not to destroy the revolution, but to fulfill it, to preserve its ideals, order, equality under law, while silencing its anarchy. He was the heir not of kings, but of the revolution itself. At least, that was what he claimed. According to recorded history, by 1799, the Directory had collapsed under its own corruption. The people were desperate for strength. The army was loyal to one man. And so, on November 9th, Napoleon seized power in a coup known as the 18th Brumaire. France had traded the chaos of democracy for the clarity of command. The revolution had birthed a soldier, and through him it would march once more. Under Napoleon's rule, France changed again. Gone were the mobs, the guillotines, the endless debates. In their place came order, swift, efficient, iron-willed. He reformed the laws of France, creating the Napoleonic Code, which enshrined many revolutionary ideals. Equality before the law, secular governance, merit over birth. He reopened churches but kept them under the state. He crowned the achievements of reason with the discipline of empire. But ambition knows no peace. In 1804, within the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame, before popes and princes, Napoleon placed a golden crown upon his own head. The gesture stunned Europe and told the world that the revolution had come full circle. A man who rose from the people now ruled as emperor. Some historians see irony in that moment. Others see inevitability. The revolution had destroyed the old monarchy only to forge a new one, born not of bloodline, but of genius and power. Yet, for all his conquests, Napoleon never escaped the spirit that made him, the restless, relentless fire of revolution. His armies carried its banners across the continent, spreading the seeds of change even as they built his empire. He became both liberator and conqueror, hero and tyrant. And behind his victories lay the silent question that would outlive him. Had France achieved freedom, or had it merely found another master? By the time his empire began to crumble, the dream of 1789 had long since transformed. What had started as a cry for liberty had reshaped the continent. Thrones had fallen, churches trembled, nations awakened. The revolution had devoured its creators, but its spirit endured, defiant, eternal. France had conquered Europe, or so it seemed. From the Pyrenees to the Alps, from the Rhine to the Nile, the eagle of Napoleon soared. But even eagles burn their wings when they fly too close to the sun. By 1812, the emperor's ambitions had outgrown even his victories. He sought to humble Russia, a vast, frozen land that refused his will. With an army of more than 600,000 men, he marched eastward into a white abyss. At first, the advance was triumphant, drums rolling, banners high, the Grande Army stretching beyond the horizon. But the Russian winter does not bow to glory. Snow buried the roads, frost devoured the living, and hunger became their only companion. The retreat from Moscow turned triumph into nightmare. According to recorded history, fewer than 1 in 5 soldiers returned. They came back hollow-eyed, their uniforms in tatters, carrying the ghosts of 1,000 comrades lost in the snow. From that moment, Napoleon's star began to fall. Prussia, Austria, Britain, and Russia joined forces against him. In 1814, Paris itself was invaded. For the first time in centuries, the people who had once chanted his name now watched in silence as he abdicated the throne. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba, a kingdom of stone and surf. But exile could not silence the will that had reshaped Europe. Within a year, he returned, landing once more on the shores of France. He marched toward Paris. No army stopped him. Soldiers sent to arrest him joined him instead. He ruled again for 100 days. Then at Waterloo, the final storm broke. Cannon smoke blackened the sky, and the empire collapsed beneath the weight of its own legend. Defeated, Napoleon surrendered to the British and was exiled again, this time to St. Helena, a lonely rock in the Atlantic. There, surrounded by sea and memory, the Emperor of the Revolution spent his final days writing, reflecting, and fading. Some historians say that in his solitude, he saw the truth too late, that the revolution he had carried on his sword was never meant to conquer the world, but to free it. He died in 1821, whispering the names of France, the army, and Josephine, the only empire that ever truly mattered to him. After the fall of Napoleon, Europe breathed again, cautious, trembling, unsure. The monarchs who had fled in terror now returned, carried on the bayonets of foreign armies. France, exhausted by 25 years of upheaval, welcomed the crown once more. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed king, took the throne in 1814, but he was no Louis XVI, and France was no longer the same nation. The revolution had rewritten the soul of the country. The peasants owned land, the nobles feared the people, and even kings ruled by consent, not divine right. The old world tried to resurrect itself, but its roots had been cut. Gone were the courtly rituals of Versailles, the untouchable privilege of birth. Even those who longed for the past could not unsee the truth. The people had tasted equality, and it could never be forgotten. Some accounts suggest that Louis XVIII ruled cautiously, aware of the ghosts that surrounded him. He wore the crown, but the revolution spirit still whispered in every hall, every law, every thought. Yet, as the decades passed, the dream dimmed. Revolutions fade, as all fires do, but beneath the ash, embers remained, waiting. By 1830, the winds of revolt rose again. Workers, students, and idealists took to the streets. The tricolor flag, once banned, flew again from the rooftops of Paris. Kings fell, republics rose, and France's destiny continued to twist through the centuries. Forever haunted, forever inspired by the promise first shouted in 1789. The French Revolution was more than an uprising. It was a rebirth of the human spirit, messy, bloody, radiant, and unstoppable. It destroyed kings and priests, but also destroyed certainty. It gave men and women a new vision of themselves, not as subjects, but as citizens. For the first time, the idea that power belonged to the people was not a dream whispered in secret, but a principle shouted in the streets. Historians believe that its echoes reshaped the modern world. In the Americas, in Europe, in colonies still chained by empires, the cry of liberty found new voices. The tricolor became not just a flag, but a symbol of defiance. Its words, liberté, égalité, fraternité, crossed oceans and generations. But every revolution is also a mirror. It reflects both the light and the shadow of human nature, our longing for justice and our hunger for power. The same fire that frees can also consume. The same ideals that unite can divide. France learned that freedom is never given. It is earned and earned again with every generation. The revolution taught the world that kings can fall, that truth can rise from a crowd, and that even the mightiest thrones tremble before the will of a people awakened. And those centuries have passed. The heartbeat of 1789 still echoes in the protests of the oppressed, in the speeches of reformers, in the dreams of all who believe that humanity can remake itself. Long after the drums had fallen silent, the revolution lived on, not in palaces or parliaments, but in hearts, in the quiet conviction that the world could be remade. The old powers of Europe tried to bury it. Kings rebuilt their thrones. Churches reclaimed their altars. Armies marched to defend the order of crowns. But no army can crush an idea. Across the continent, the people remembered. In Italy and Germany, in Greece and Poland, voices rose again for liberty. In the Americas, revolutions flared from Venezuela to Haiti, each carrying a sparklet in France. Historians believe that by the mid-19th century, the revolution spirit had become the blueprint of modernity. The belief that every human being possesses rights not granted by kings, but by existence itself. Yet the flame that warmed also burned. Industrial cities filled with workers who now demanded the equality once promised. Women who had been silenced during the revolution began to claim their place within it. And nations, born from its ideals, wrestled with the contradictions it had left behind. Freedom and order, equality and ambition, reason and power. Some accounts suggest that even the great thinkers of later ages, Marx, Tocqueville, Hugo, stood in its shadow. Each tried to make sense of what France had unleashed. Was it a triumph of justice or a warning of chaos? A dawn of enlightenment or a descent into madness? Perhaps it was both. For the revolution was not perfection. It was humanity in full, raw form, beautiful, brutal, and alive. And its flame, once lit, could never be extinguished. Every generation since has asked the same question. What was it all for? The revolution promised liberty, but brought terror. It promised equality, but unleashed war. It promised fraternity, but divided a nation. And yet, despite the contradictions, its ideals remain sacred. According to recorded history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen, written in 1789, became one of the most influential documents in human history. Its words, fragile as parchment, outlasted guillotines and empires alike. They declare that all men are born free and equal in rights. They declare that law is the expression of the general will. They declare that sovereignty rests in the people. Those ideas changed not only France but the world. They became the seed of democracy in Europe, the pulse of independence in Latin America, the moral compass for those who stood against tyranny in every century that followed. But the revolution also taught darker lessons. It showed how easily justice can turn to vengeance, how ideals can harden into dogma, and how the cry for equality can drown in the noise of fear. It taught that freedom without conscience becomes cruelty, and that power, even when born in the name of the people, can corrupt all the same. Some historians say that the true legacy of the revolution is not victory, but vigilance, a reminder that liberty must always be defended, that equality must always be renewed, and that every generation must decide anew what kind of world it wishes to build. From the ashes of the revolution rose the modern age. Nations were no longer kingdoms, but republics. Citizens replaced subjects. The right to speak, to vote, to dream, these became the new inheritance of humanity. The revolution reshaped not only France, but the soul of civilization. It marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of ours. Its banners, liberté, égalité, fraternité, still flutter in the winds of protest, in the halls of parliaments, in the voices of those who refuse to be silent. It remains a warning and a promise that progress demands sacrifice, that freedom is fragile, and that justice must never sleep. 2 centuries later, the questions it raised still burn within us. How much freedom are we willing to risk for safety? How much equality are we willing to fight for? And can humanity ever find harmony between the two? The French Revolution did not answer these questions. It merely asked them louder than anyone ever had before. And in doing so, it changed the sound of history itself. Some say the revolution ended in blood, but perhaps it never ended at all. Perhaps it lives in every act of defiance, every voice that speaks truth to power, every hand that reaches across lines once drawn in hate. The world that was born in 1789 is still being born. And as long as we believe that tomorrow can be better than today, the revolution, in all its glory and terror, its light and its shadow, still lives within us. The French Revolution was not the fall of an age, but the awakening of one. It began with bread and ended with ideals, ideals that have outlived kings, empires, and centuries. For when humanity dares to imagine itself free, no crown, no chain, and no fear can ever truly silence it. And so history remembers. The 18th century was a time of awakening, when the world, for the first time, began to believe that it belonged to itself.